I'm very happy to be invited to do this online workshop, Diversity, Inclusive Communication and Cooperation. And you see my slogan for this workshop, Cultures Don't Meet, People Do. And you also see the cover of a book that I wrote together with my colleague Arjan Verdoren. It's an artwork of a South African artist, and she wants to depict the uniqueness of each person, which is a very important notion in my lecture today. My name is Edwin Hoffman. I'm Dutch, but I was born in Indonesia. Maybe you know, once it was a colony of the Netherlands, and after it got independent, I went with my parents to the Netherlands, where I grew up, studied for a long time, and also worked for a long time. And since 2009, I live now in Austria. And I work as an independent lecturer, trainer, and also author in the field of intercultural communication and diversity competence. And I also teach at the Alpen Adria University in Klagenfurt. The program for today is as follows. I forgot to say that I would like to ask you that if you have comments or questions, that you could put them in the chat. So I will look at it, and we at the end of this workshop and in between, I shall try to answer them. Yes. The program for today, after my introduction, I will start with an input. What is intercultural communication? Then at 10 o'clock, I also would like to make it interactive, our session. We have an assignment, my personal coat of arms, in a breakout room. After that, I start with my input, inclusive communication, first part. And after the break, 11 o'clock, we will have a break of 10 minutes. I continue with the second part. Then again, a breakout session, cultural habits at work. And at 12 o'clock, I will introduce and apply the TOPOI model that I developed on a case study. And then we have 10 minutes left for plenary questions. And we close the workshop at 12:30. So that's the program for this online seminar. Okay, often I start my workshops, my lectures, with showing two conversations and the questions which of these conversations you would call intercultural, as a little brainstorming. The first conversation is between Sanne and Abby. They are both supervisors of PhD students, and they have a meeting, and Abby says to Sanne, the attitude of the PhD students disturbs me. They often interrupt during conversations and meetings and try to push their own agendas. They try to redirect tasks to me as their supervisor and take too little responsibility in this respect. Now, Sanne disagrees with him, and she says, I find the candidates very committed. What you say about their attitude, I interpret as showing initiative, being assertive, and having trust in us as their supervisors. So the question is, would you call this an intercultural conversation or just a common conversation? Or sometimes people talk about an intracultural communication. The second conversation is the same conversation, in fact, only in Dutch, because Marijke and Jan Wouters, they are both Dutch. And they also are both supervisors of PhD students. And Jan says the same as Abby. In fact, de houding van mijn promovend die stoort mij. Ze onderbreken vaak tijdens gesprekken en vergaderingen en proberen hun eigen agenda door te drukken. Ze proberen taken door te schuiven naar mij als hun begeleider en nemen daarbij te weinig verantwoordelijkheid. Ik vind de kandidaten, zegt Marijke als antwoord, zeer betrokken. Wat je zegt over hun houding interpreteer ik als initiatief tonen, assertief zijn en vertrouwen hebben in ons als hun begeleiders. So also here the question, would you call this an intercultural conversation because there's a difference in view? Or do you say it's a normal conversation, common conversation, or maybe an intra-cultural communication because they are both a member of the Dutch society? So most people say that this conversation is intercultural. And when I ask them, why do you think this is intercultural? I get the explanation that they say, yeah, they belong to different national cultures. Abby is from Ethiopia. and Sanne is from the Netherlands, and that's why they have a different cultural background, and because of that they have a different view, different opinion about the PhD candidates. This approach in which you focus and people focus on the national background of the participants in the conversation is called a culturalistic approach of intercultural interactions. So what you do, and this cultural approach is very persistent. You find it in a lot of literature about intercultural communication and intercultural management, and also in many, many workshops and trainings, this cultural approach is applied. And I think it has a lot of risk, and that's why I would like to elaborate on it. So in the culturalistic approach, people are seen only as representing their national, ethnic, or religious background, and they are not seen as unique individuals. And what also happens in the culturalistic approach is that people's behavior, so how they behave and what their attitude is, what their view is, what their values are attributed to their culture or religion and considered to be only cultural or religious, though there may be other reasons why people behave like they behave and think what they think. I will give some examples from different fields of work, and I hope that you can transfer them to your own practice. For this attribution of culture to behavior, I would like to give the example of a job interview. The candidate is a woman and she wears a headscarf. And she comes to the job interview and the employer is very kind and he asks her, could I offer you a cup of coffee? And the woman, the candidate says, no, thank you. And immediately the employer responds, yes, completely forgotten, it is Ramadan. You are not allowed to drink anything or to eat anything. And the woman, the candidate says, no, I would like to have a cup of tea if you have. So this is for me a nice example to see that people tend to immediately focus on the, in this case, on the headscarf, since she's Muslima, and that her wish, when she said, no, thank you, no coffee, that it is because of her religious background. So you see, very quick people attribute behavior or attitudes to a culture or a religion. And it could lead to often negative stereotyping and generalizing. I invented this, but these are prevailing images of Ethiopia and Holland, of the Netherlands, and it could be that because of this difference in opinion, that Sanne thinks, it's typical Ethiopian, what he says, so authoritarian, macho and status sensitive. And Abby could think, typical Dutch, that's so an image of the Netherlands, so informal, tolerant, and no respect. So this could happen in a real conversation that leads to stereotypes and to generalizing. Jürgen Bolton, he's a German scholar, compares looking at culture and looking at intercultural communication with zooming in and zooming out. Culturalists zoom out. So instead of looking at who are these persons, why do they have these ideas, what is the concrete situation of what happens in the concrete interactions, they zoom out to the countries and say they have a difference in opinion because they belong to different countries. So they go far away from the concrete situation and the people involved and zoom out to, in this case, to the Netherlands and Ethiopia, to the characteristics of Ethiopian culture and the characteristics of Dutch culture to explain why they have these differences. But even culturalists zoom out further. For instance, you know, maybe this book of Huntington, who writes about the clash of civilizations. And you find many literature about Western and non-Western culture, collectivistic and individualistic cultures, guilt and shame cultures, cold and hot climate cultures. I read a book about that, and passive and active culture. So you see that to explain the interaction between two people, between concrete persons who have differences in their behavior or in their view, they take serious about large collectives. They take the characteristics of large collectives to explain why these differences exist. And when it is about intercultural competence from a culturalistic approach, They focus on the national, ethnic, or religious background of a person as the most important characteristic of a person's identity and the main explanation for her or his behavior. So that means that intercultural competence is especially knowledge. You have to have knowledge about the characteristics of the national, ethnic, or religious cultural background of the person if you want to communicate with somebody, if you have to deal with them. And very famous scholars in this field are Geert Hofstede, von Strompenaars, Erin Meijer, and Richard Lewis. The best known scholar is Geert Hofstede. And for sure, his research is very, very important. It has a major influence on the theory of intercultural communication and intercultural management. And Geert Hofstede, he's a Dutch scholar. He classifies countries according to 6 dimensions. Maybe you know these dimensions. This overview, I collected the results of the countries of the Circle universities, and you will get this afterwards. After the workshop, you will receive this overview also with some more information about these dimensions, but I explain it now very short. So the 6 dimensions are, the first one is individualistic or collectivistic. So an individualistic culture focus in such a culture that people focus mainly, they take care for themselves and their immediate family. And in collectivistic cultures, people are very loyal to their groups, to their family, to their in-group, to their ethnic group. And maybe you know the South African saying, I am because we are. So it's very clear that the group is very important. That's the starting point to give meaning to your life. The second dimension is power dimension. That means in a country with a large power dimensions, the power positions of the people who are in power are fixed. For instance, as a student, you cannot start a discussion with your professor. As an employee, you cannot criticize your boss. So there's a large power distance. And in countries, in cultures with a low power distance, people try to equalize the power positions. Uncertainty avoidance means that people in cultures with a high uncertainty avoidance try to avoid situations and people that are not that are uncertain. So in the sense that their behavior and their ideas are unusual. So you have to avoid these people and these situations. People want certainty. They want to know what will happen. It should be predictable, the situations and the people, and they don't like to take risks. So that would be cultures with a high uncertainty avoidance. And with low uncertainty avoidance, people like risk. They are open for innovations, for new ideas, also for behavior that is not so usual. Masculine and feminine. Masculine cultures focus especially mainly on competition and on the winners in the society, and feminine cultures focus more on the quality of life, and they also take care of the weak in the society. Long-term, short-term. Short-term is more oriented on traditions, and long-term more to prepare for the culture, so they are more innovative. And the last one, he added that this last dimensions, Geert Hofstede, is indulgence and restraint. Indulgence means, can you enjoy life and express it that you are enjoying life? Or do you live in a restrained culture where there are strict social norms how to behave? And there's less joy in such a culture. In indulgent culture, there's a lot of joy and pleasure, and people express that also in public. But in the restrained culture, there are many strict social norms how to behave. Okay, these are the dimensions of Hofstede, and Hofstede warns. He says you can only use these dimensions to compare countries, to compare cultures. But unfortunately, many trainers, but also Geert Hofstede himself, applies this on the interpersonal communication. I will give an example. And I will now mention some great risks of a culturalistic approach. What I experience in my workshops. I give many workshops also for professionals and organizations, and this kind of risks I see that they can happen. The first of all is that you reduce a person to only her or his national, ethnic, or religious identity to explain things. I mentioned already Hofstede that despite his warning not to apply it on interpersonal communication, he gives an example in his book of an Indonesian manager. His name is Marcus, and the Dutch manager, he's a colleague of a Dutch manager in Jakarta, Indonesia. His name is Frans. They share together the same office, and Marcus has a meeting and he needs a chair. So he comes to the office of Marcus and him, and he takes a chair because, as I said, one chair is short. And Frans only jokingly says to him, "Are you out stealing again?" And Marcus gets furious. And the only explanation that Geert Hofstede gives in this example is that he says in Indonesia, status is sacred and an insult is always taken literally. Frans should have known that. So you see that Frans should have this knowledge to know that this would really offend Marcus. So the only explanation is Marcus is Indonesian, status is sacred for him, and he takes each insult literally, and that's why he is so angry. So he reduces him to his national identity, and Hofstede ignores other possible factors why he gets so angry. And maybe he doesn't understand this joke, Marcus. Maybe he doesn't joke at all, or maybe the words of Frans brings him back to the colonial time, where the Dutch treated the Indonesians very inferior. So all these other possible explanation, but also possible identities of Marcus are ignored. A reduction to only a national, ethnic, or religious identity. The second risk is generalizing and stereotyping. If you only focus on the national identity of a person, and you easily leads to a fight for adaptation. And an international student from Senegal wanted to buy a photo camera it was in Belgium, it happened in Belgium, and he goes to and he asked the shop employee for the price of a certain photo camera he has seen. There was no price. And the shop employee immediately responds to him, "This is not Africa. We don't negotiate here." So it was so hurtful for this student, because he said, "I want to buy it. I don't see a price. I'm just asking for the price." Generalizing, and immediately you have this we versus them. We don't negotiate, and it easily leads to a fight for adaptation. The third thing is that the person is only considered as a product of his or her culture, not as a producer. Each of us processes all the cultural offerings we get in our life, from our childhood on, from our parents, from the schools, from the friends, from the schools we visit. All these cultural offerings, we processes that in an own unique way. So the starting point is always the fundamental individuality of each person. We are not only a product, we also change certain habits that were passed on. We acquire new cultural habits. Sometimes we leave them behind. So we are also producer, and not in the words of Geert Hofstede, who says culture, that is the software of the mind of people, as if we don't program our mind ourselves also. It culturalizes all kinds of differences and make behavior extraordinarily different. I have an example of a labor office. I gave a workshop, and sometimes I start asking, what do you want to learn? And one participant asked me, could you explain a lot about the Islam? And I said, why? Did you have a certain experience or so? Why you want this information? And she said, yeah, I talked to a jobless person, a migrant, he has a migration background. And from the beginning on, he was sitting very unrestfully on his chair. And before I had finished the conversation, he jumped off from his chair and ran away without saying goodbye to me. That, of course, wasn't nice for her. So she said, I went to my colleague and I told her my experience. And she explained me that, she said, yeah, I know these men, these are Muslims and they are not allowed to talk longer than 10 minutes with a woman. And that's why he was so unrestful, and that's why he ran away. So please tell me more about the Islam so that I'm prepared for this kind of behavior. And it was so interesting that immediately another participant raised her hand and said, that's pure nonsense what your colleague said, because I also have this experience, also a migrant, jobless person. And this man only had parked his car in a wrong way, and that's why he was in such a hurry. So for me, this is a very nice example that people tend to immediately focus on the culture, or in this case, on the religion, and they make behavior extraordinary, and they don't think of normal reasons like, yeah, I have parked my car in the wrong way. So please hurry up with the conversation. I have to I must return to my car. So it culturalizes all kinds of differences, also in the example of the job interview. Also, a risk is that you focus only on differences and not what people also have in common. It's for me so important that you don't think that when you meet somebody from Indonesia that there are only differences, but we also have a lot of in common. That's why we will also do this assignment of the coat of arms. But the last thing is for me the most important one. What I see is that many professionals lose their power, forget about all the competences they have, and they lose their balance. And it also can take the other person out of her or his power or balance. And I have a case study at the end of this seminar, and to illustrate this. But the first one, I remember a very experienced employee of again from a labor office. He, in the workshop, he asked me, say, I have to work with a jobless person from Somalia, and I want to find out his motivation. How can I do that? So how can I find out what the motivation is of a Somalian jobless person? So what kind of work he would like to work, what is important for him? And I said to him, did you already ask him? And he said, can I just ask him? We Dutch, are we not too direct? Shouldn't I ask indirect questions? So what do your family think? What you want to do or has to do? You see that he, because of this idea, it's now intercultural communication. So I need other skills. He forgets about all the competences he has. And I have many examples of professionals who think that they have to act in a different way and don't use the competences they have because they think I have to act in a different way. Okay, these are the main risk, but also a risk of a culturalistic approach is that it can be used as a legitimization, as a justification for behavior. The people just say, with the aim, and that they say, okay, I don't need to change because it's our culture. That's the way we do it. It can also be used in that way, or as a strategy. I heard the story of a general manager, Dutch general manager in Taiwan, and he had a negotiation with the president of a very important Taiwanese company in Taiwan. And you know maybe that there is this norm that you always should take care that Asians don't lose face. And Jan Teune, that's his name of the general manager, said he really used that, his president, to get additional discount. He really said to me, I lose face if I don't get this discount. When I go back to my company and I haven't got this additional discount, I lose my face. So sometimes it's also used culture or characteristics of a certain culture as a strategy to get things done. So these are the risks of a culturalistic approach, and that's why I developed as I call it, an inclusive systemic approach. It's so obvious, but we don't dwell on it. But each of us, each person is part of many collectives. You can call them also social systems, groups of people with a shared partial commonality and a certain and certain common habits. So you see here some examples of collectives, of social system: a family, a group of friends, a team, a religious group, a sports club, but also internet communities. These are all examples of collectives. They have a partial commonality in the sense they are family members, for instance, but they are much more than only family members. That's only the part that they share within their family. And each of these collectives is characterized by a certain, less or more, by a certain culture. And following Jan Blommaert, sociolinguist in Belgium, very famous, sadly he passed away last year. He defines culture. There are many definitions of culture, but I would like to define it in following Jan Blommaert as a social order, a kind of foundation of habits that characterizes a social group or a social interaction. And the content of culture is a certain language, knowledge, symbols, rituals, heroes, values, and norms, traditions. So that is the content of a culture. And culture can range from a first encounter. I will explain that later. I will explain it in a minute. That can range from a first encounter between two people to a social group, for instance, friends, to a highly developed large-scale society, with very highly developed cultures, with language, traditions, symbols, and so on. And that means, and it's for me so very important, because we only link culture to a national culture, but there are as many cultures as there are social groups and meaningful social interactions. Jan Blommaert says that culture in its most elementary form is created already in a social interaction as a shared social order, a foundation to make meaningful interaction, communication, cooperation possible. So he says, for example, when you are in a foreign country, you don't speak the language, but you manage together with the other person with heavily body language to ask the way and to get the right direction, how you have to go. If you manage that, you already create with each other a culture in the sense of a foundation for meaningful communication. A certain language, certain non-formal language, and certain also values, the way how your attitude, how you ask it, so that you can already mention a culture. And in fact, we also in this online meeting we have a culture together, in the sense that we have some habits, how we deal with each other, how we communicate with each other. So that is already I would call a culture. And then is the question, of course, what is then intercultural communication? So if you are part of a culture, you know the habits, you know the commonalities, you know also the differences. But in an intercultural communication, in this case, it's based on Stephanie's Ratchet theory. It is not a collision between cultures. It's not a collision between let's say when you look at this picture between the US and Japan, for instance. No, and she defines, and I fully agree with her. I follow this concept of intercultural communication. It is a missing link in the interaction between people because the differences are unfamiliar. And this is also a nice illustration that often you think I have to prepare when I meet somebody from a different country, but the other person also can prepare him or herself when he meets you. So it's not a collision. Interculture doesn't mean a collision between cultures, but it is a missing link. You are not familiar with the differences in the communication. You talk to somebody and somebody is not looking in your eyes, so you are confused. You are maybe not familiar with this difference, and then you can say this is an intercultural moment. Or somebody, as in the conversation I showed, has such a different point of view that it's for me not familiar. In that sense, you can say that it's an intercultural situation. And I hope that I made clear that this intercultural communication also can happen between, for instance, a boy, a brother and a sister, because they participate in different collectives with different cultures. So it can be that in a conversation, they also are surprised about some habits of the sisters, surprised by the habit of the habits of her brother, because she doesn't know these habits, and because she participates in a culture that is for her completely unfamiliar, unknown. So that's maybe a new definition of intercultural communication, a missing link in the interaction because of unfamiliar differences. And these differences can be of all kinds, and not only cultural. So I hope that I made clear, and I hope that you can agree that each of us, each person, because he or she participates in many collectives characterized by a certain cultures, and from each group you can derive an identity, that each of us is characterized by multi-collectivity, multiculturality, and that we all have a multiple identity. We have many identities. We are not only a scientist, I'm not only a lecturer, I'm also a father, I'm also a man, so I have many, many identities. And sometimes people say to me in workshops or in lectures, they say, yeah, but Edwin, the national culture is more, shapes a person much more, has much more influence than a subculture. So sometimes they call the other collective subcultures. And I have a nice example that the subculture can be more important, can shape a person much more than the national cultures. I live in the neighborhood of Croatia. I visit this country, often Istria, and I talked with Vedran Frankovic about my work, and he said, he told me a beautiful story about his grandfather who was born in the beginning of the last century. And he said, my father never left his village, but he lived in 4 countries. He never left his village, but he lived in 4 countries. So in the beginning, it was Hungarian, Austrian, Habsburger Empire. Then he lived in, it was also a part of Italy once, and then afterwards it was Yugoslavia, and now he lives in Croatia, but it didn't influence him in any way, did all these national cultures, because he was a farmer and the head of a family. That was more important for him. He lived in his village. That was more important for him than all these national cultures. So, so I would now like to continue with inclusive communication, as I call it. Some key elements I want to discuss with you. And first of all, inclusive communication means for me the humanization of otherness. So the stranger, the people from abroad, people with a different religion or ethnic background, they are like us, and they are not more complex, not stranger than we are ourselves. So that is for me the way of inclusive communication, and not a culturalist approach in which strangers, people from abroad, are presented as another kind of human beings for whom you need a special intercultural competence to deal with. Okay, now first of all, I think it's important. I think I repeat myself by saying that you should deculturalize intercultural communication. You always meet a unique person who has a lot of identities, and is not only her or his national identity. And deculturalizing doesn't mean for me that you ignore the culture, but culture is only one of the aspects that has shaped a person. And so instead of focusing on the culture, you focus on the unique person you meet. So that is for me deculturalizing, and not this culturalistic approach that only focus on ethnicity, nationality, religion, or sometimes only on color. The next thing is consider identity as a multiple and as a movable feast, as Stuart Hall says. And so now in this moment, I think you are all in the first place scientists, but maybe later in the evening, when you visit your family because there's a birthday, you are in the first place a family member. So you see that identity can alternate. It can shift to another identity. It depends of the situation and biography, which identity is for you the most important one. And in the communication, you can sometimes use this. I think of one nice example is that it was a labor office, and one of the employees he said, Edwin, I didn't know before this concept of you, but I applied it in a conversation with a woman. She wanted to work again, but her husband said, no, you are not allowed to work. And I asked her, why are you not allowed to work? And he said, yes, my work is in an elders home, and I have to wash men. And my husband doesn't want that I wash men. And then he asked her without judging, he said, what is he afraid for? Why are you not allowed? She said, yeah, he fears, he is afraid of intimacy or sexuality. So I can understand that, said the man from the labor office. And then he said so beautiful to her, he said to her, well, maybe it helps you for yourself, but also for the conversation with your husband to convince him that you can do this work, that you don't do this work as a woman, but as a nurse, and that you don't wash men, but residents who are old and sick. And that really indeed helped her to get the permission of her husband to do this work. So sometimes you can use it, and I also think of a mediator who told me the story that she also used this different identities. It was a conflict between an engineer from Taiwan, and his director is Norwegian, and they had a big conflict, but they could find each other when they discovered, when the mediator focused on being that they are both fathers, and they could understand each other in their efforts to be a good father and also to take care of their family. And that was a common identity which helped them to bridge the differences they have. So sometimes you can use it also when a person is reducing himself or herself to a certain identity, and that you can support him or her to focus on another identity. Okay, the next one is, it's a very interesting question I often get is that people ask me, professionals, is it the person who acts and or is it the culture? So don't confuse yourself with this question. It is always the person who acts, not the culture. Of course, he's influenced by culture, but the person is finally, eventually, is the one who is responsible for his or her deeds. So it is always the person who acts. But people get confused by this question. There was once a civil servant of a child protection organization, and he said to me, I have to deal with a father from Iraq, he beats his child. Is it the person or is it the culture? I said, why is it important for you? And he said to me, when it is the culture, I'm more careful, I am more cautious. But if it is the person, I know what to do. And I said to him, I have never seen a person, a culture who beats a child. So it is always the person, of course, influenced by culture, but you can address the person and question his or her behavior. I always use this model to illustrate this, and this is also an answer to a question of Thierry. When three people meet, A, B, and C, from totally different countries, Argentina, Belgium, and Congo, for instance, these three persons meet, then never forget that they are all human beings. And that's also something that people sometimes think they have different needs, different emotions, different competences. No, we are all human beings. The next level, they belong to different cultures, not only a national culture. So as Murray and Kluckman says, I am like some people. So it is possible that the person from Argentina shares more with the person from Congo than with her own neighbor, because they like the same music, they have the same age, and so on and so on. So the limits are not at the national borders, because they are from different nationalities. But eventually, ultimately, the communication always takes place on the level of unique persons. And in that sense, I am like no one. So I don't mean that personality is not the same as a certain kind of culture. No, a personality that is the uniqueness of each person. His or her character, his or her physical traits, that is the unique personality who processes all the cultural offerings that are passed on in her or his life. So always stay and go to the level of the persons. So even when people say that is how we do it, that is our cultures, that you can ask, what do you mean by that? So then you get clues, you get leads to continue the communication. So that's it. You are influenced by culture, but finally it is you as a person who is responsible for your deeds, and you can also change things and don't use culture as an excuse and for legitimation to say, yeah, it's my culture, that's the way we do it, and I can't help it, I can change it. So that's why also my slogan, cultures don't meet, people do. Be true to who you are. For me, also very important. People sometimes get paralyzed when they meet somebody from a different country, because they think, now I have to communicate in a different way. I feel insecure. Be concerned, authentic, have trust in yourself, and decisive in the communication, because often people are afraid to make mistakes, to discriminate. But what counts in the communication, what is decisive, is your dedication, your attitude of respect, openness, and sincerity. And then you can make mistakes. And in that sense, work with the effects of your communication. You do something and you see that the other person is shocked or surprised, and then you can say, okay, did I do something wrong? And not this paralyzed attitude from, oh, I'm afraid to do something wrong, or these lists with do's and don'ts. Be yourself, because otherwise you get a cold instrumental communication. And on the other hand, be prepared and open for differences and surprises. And as a tool, I developed the TOPOI model. The TOPOI stands for 5 areas in the communications where misunderstandings can arise and where differences can arise. And I developed it in Dutch, and you see between parentheses the Dutch word for it. So TOPOI stands for taal, that is tong. I translated with as tong. Ordening is order. Personen is persons. Organisatie is organization. And inzet is intentions. And I want to preserve, to maintain TOPOI, because TOPOI in Greek means places. It's plural of topos. So for me, these are the places in the communications where differences can arise and misunderstandings. And I only can explain it, clarify it a little bit because of the time, but if you are interested in our book that I mentioned before, you can find many examples also from the practice, what kind of differences you can meet. So for me, these are, I translated in fact, all kinds of differences, and not only cultural, into these 5 areas of communication. In that sense, it's just more concrete. Instead of this abstract cultural differences, it's more concrete that you know that there are differences when we look at language, at tongue, different communication styles. People are direct or indirect, explicit or more implicit in their communication. There are different ways how you can be polite, how you can give feedback. The connotations of words words can have a different meaning. A dog sometimes is a pet, but for somebody else, a dog is maybe an animal you can eat. So words can have different connotations. There are different interaction rules, topics, body, and also very important, many differences in the non-verbal language, the body language, the way people greet, make eye contact, the distance they take towards you, silence, how you deal with silence, with time, closing, socially accepted behavior, how do you behave during dinner, and so on and so on. And for me, it's not that you have to learn these by heart, but that you are sensitive, prepared that these kind of differences can occur. And for instance, in opposite to a cultural approach, who could say, if you meet a Muslim, you are a woman, and you meet you are a man and you meet a Muslim woman, then you don't shake hands with her, because that's not allowed. I say, no, be yourself, reach out your hand, but be prepared that maybe the person greets in another way. And we give examples, and I can give examples of different ways of greeting. The next area is entails the view and the logic of the of the people involved. So the people have different views of humanity, of life, of the world, on the issues at hand. They have also different ways of reasoning, more holistic or more analytical, deductive or inductive. Sometimes people immediately start with the most important, with the conclusion, to say so, but other people start with first with the details and then come to the conclusion. So there are different ways of how people think, the logic of people. The next level is persons, and that's about identities, roles, and relations. Now, what kind of images do you have of the other person? Face and honor, is a very important aspect. Now, and here you also see the dimensions of Hofstede, for instance. So people can be more masculine in the sense that they are very competition-oriented, or they are more caring. They are focused more on the quality of life. This is femininity. Now, gender equality, status is different. Sometimes people say what kind of family a person comes from, that has status for me. And another person says, no, status is, the older people are, the more status they have. And another person says, no, for me, is status what kind of education or what kind of work someone does. These kind of differences you can meet on the relational level, the area of persons. Organizational, very important. Differences, misunderstandings have nothing to do with culture, but it has to do with legislation, political context, the facilities, all kind of organizational aspects that can play a role in a concrete conversation. And the last one for me, very, very important. It's not visible, but people have their motives, emotions, needs, values, and spirituality in the sense from what is the meaning of life for persons. And I separated these 5 areas, but in practice you cannot separate them. For instance, now in this moment I have a certain language. I give my view of intercultural communication. You and I, though we don't see each other, feel something of a relationship we have. It is organized online, and we all have at this moment our motives, emotions, needs, and values that also play a role in our communication now. But I separated them to get many ideas what you could do, what goes wrong, and what you could do. And I will give an example at the end based on a case study. So that is for me TOPOI. Instead of linking all these differences to certain cultures and countries, so no, these are differences you can meet in each communication with somebody. And it can help you to reflect what kind of differences play a role here, what kind of misunderstandings do we have. Okay, then a very, very important assumption in the communication with everybody is the assumption, what I call, of the goodwill. Behind every behavior, there's a positive intention. So this is the metaphor of an iceberg. We see, we experience a negative behavior of somebody, and immediately we judge him or her negative. We jump immediately to negative conclusions. And I think it's very important on the communication to always assume how negative or difficult behavior is. Can be, and that you always assume the person has good reasons why he or she does what he or she does. And so I will give an example. And it is for me then very important when you want to change a certain behavior or certain ideas people have. Somebody said so beautiful, the shortcut is the day to. Instead of immediately start engage in a battle of the truth, or to judge somebody, or to punish somebody, first try to find out what the intentions of this person are. You don't look me in the eyes. Why don't you look me in the eyes? And people can say, for me, it is not respectful to look in the eyes. It is for me respectful to look away. So always try to find out if you meet negative behavior and it disturbs you, that you ask what is behind it, and assume that these are good reasons. and then you can recognize this, and recognition is important for every person. It's very essential, recognition, that people feel recognized. And when people feel recognized, they can open up for to listen to you and to change their behavior or to change their idea. And recognition is not the same as that you agree with somebody, but it means from, okay, that's also a way of doing things. That's also a way. That's also a valid point of view. I don't agree with your behavior, but I can understand the reasons for your behavior. And after this recognition, as I said, then it is easier for people to open up for another view, for other behavior. Always this recognition. I give an example, and sometimes it's very hard to see this positive intention, but I think now of a student, I don't know, from one of a South Asian country, and she committed plagiarism, and the professor talked with her about it, and he said, why didn't you mention the sources of this book? And you know what the student said? But I bought the book, I paid for it, so it's legal, so it's my book, so I can just copy things from the book. So you see, sometimes it's very, for you, incomprehensible why people do what they do, but it's good to first to ask, and then you can recognize this and then say, okay, but that is not correct. Even when you have bought the book, you have to mention the source when you use certain quotes. I have an example of an Austrian student. This is an assignment I often give to students. Say, okay, recall a bad experience and try to find out what may be the good reasons of this person. And she wrote this case study. She said, when my husband, my little son, and I visited our friend Hassan in Oman 4 years ago, I met some of Hassan's friends, and many of them shook hands with my husband in friendship, but not with me. Some of them didn't even look me in the eye. The first time it was very uncomfortable for me, and it also felt disrespectful. Now I fully understand, Barbara, and it is so good that you don't confirm your stereotypes and prejudices and judge these and jump immediately to negative conclusion as that they don't respect women. So she talked about it with Hassan. And she asked, why is this behavior of your friends? And it turned out, Hassan explained that his friends were very respectful and didn't want to embarrass her husband by looking at me or touching me. So these were positive reasons why the man didn't shake my hand and look me in the eyes. And that's what she wrote, her reflection. I only saw the tip of the iceberg, the negative behavior, and saw this as the truth, was irritated and judged their behavior negatively. The motivations of the men, their goodwill came to the surface in the dialogue with our friend Hassan. So this is, for me, a nice example, instead of immediately jumping to negative conclusions, that you assume that they have good reasons and that you try to find them out, to explore them. Okay, then diversity competence. Now, for me, it is not, I follow Stephanie Ratje, so it's not knowing all kinds of cultural characteristics, but it is the ability to transform an experience of strangeness, because you are not familiar with differences. It is your ability to transform it into normality, that they become familiar for you. And thus you create again, maybe a common ground, and that is culture, in fact. And again, a connection for further communication, interaction, cooperation, or just further living together. And I come back to this example of these two men who greet each other in a different way. That's an example of an intercultural situation. And if you are a diversity competence like Obama, of course, he is prepared, then you find a way to find a way to meet each other. So a difference is transformed in a familiar difference, and you create so a foundation, a culture, in fact, with each other. So that's the way how we communicate with each other. That's the way how we greet each other. So So you can transform, that is diversity competence. You are able to transform an experience of strangeness with your diversity competence into culturality. You create with each other new habits, maybe, or common. You can, of course, you can also adapt, but then again, you have a connection, a foundation for further meaningful communication, interaction, cooperation, and so on. Good, and the next thing is that see communication as a circular process, not as a linear process, as it is often depicted of sender and receiver, but from a system theoretical approach, communication is always circular. And think of the axiom of Václavík: you cannot not communicate, and you always have a part in how the communication goes. Even as a listener, your non-verbal language influences the speaker. So instead of, that means that, for instance, when you have a difficult conversation with somebody, don't blame immediately the other person, but also ask yourself, what am I doing that he or she is acting in that way? And what is also important, and what we often forget, is the influence of social representations. Social representations are the prevailing, collectively shared and created common images, the prejudices, stereotypes, single stories we have, perceptions, knowledge and norms that are in the air, to say so. We have, they are, you cannot identify them and say in certain persons that you can say that person is saying this, or this person has this image. No, it's collectively constructed in media, in how people talk in the street, at the kitchen table, what you read in books. So these are created on a collective level and anonymous, to say so. And what social representation are also the historical and current experience of the collective. I will give an example. So also experiences a collective has experience. So not the person himself or herself, but her or his group has experienced that. For instance, colonialism, it still can influence the person in a conversation. And so the Glenn Halberg, he's a psychiatrist, and he says, in what we say to each other and understand from each other, our personal past and our collective past also play a role. I will give an example, what happened at a university in the Netherlands. There was a janitor. The janitor, he was asked to be more strict towards a student who smoked at places where it is not allowed. And he spoke to a Surinamese student. I have to add that he is Surinamese because that plays an important role in this communication. And you should know that these two had a very good relationship, in fact. And the janitor said to him, you are not allowed to smoke here, you know that, so please stop. And the student, he says, okay, one moment, I'm nearly ready. And then the janitor said to him, you have to adapt like all the others. And in that moment, the student became furious. He was so angry. And we discussed this afterwards because they were both confused. As I said, they had, in fact, a good relationship. And suddenly he was so angry, the student. And what happened is we asked the janitor first, what do you mean with you have to adapt like all the others? And the janitor said, yeah, he has to adapt like all the other students. But what happened with the student, suddenly he said, I don't know why I got so angry, but suddenly I felt like a black Afro-Surinamese. And also you should know that Suriname also was a colony of the Netherlands, and there was also slavery by the Dutch. So suddenly I felt like a black Afro-Surinamese and a white Dutchman who is correcting me. So can you imagine that this happened? Because also that happened because of the word adapt. You have to adapt like all the others. That is what you can hear often in the Netherlands. Foreigners, migrants have to adapt. And this word to adapt, that triggered him and made him feel that way. So I hope you can understand that this is a real situation. And we asked the janitor, would you have chosen the same words when the student was a white Dutch person? And he said, very honestly, he said that maybe I would have said something else. You are not so free in what you say. But at the same time, it's not about guilt. We asked the student, why did you react that way? So I don't know what happened with me. You are also not so free in what you understand of each other. So it's very important that sometimes you say things or do things because of these social representations, and that can discriminate, that can hurt somebody, but it can also happen that the other person understands something and feels very hurt because of a certain words or a certain act. And so, and especially in the communication with people with different background or a different color, these social representations in the form of prejudices, stereotypes can happen, and that you say something or do something because of these stereotypes. And I must say, everybody has prejudices. For me, it's not only a white problem to say so, but everybody has prejudices. And I always give the example of the person who made a flight with an Ethiopian company, and I must say it was after the apartheid. And this passenger sees the airplane and sees the pilot, and he sees that they are black. And his first thought was, are they able to manage an airplane? And I asked them, who was this person? And this person was Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela tells his story in his book, The Long Way. So also he, how we say that, incorporated these prejudices. So nobody is free of prejudice. Only be aware, but you should be aware that sometimes they pop up, and you do something, say things, and people can feel hurt. But and on the other hand, I think the other person should also should have a kind of mildness, and to understand that there are not always bad intentions behind this kind of behavior. Okay, to illustrate once more the social representations, maybe you know this example, but this is what I always show in my lectures and workshops. This example, a boy and his father were involved in a fatal automobile accident. The father was killed instantly. The son was severely injured. An ambulance rushed him to the nearest hospital, and a prominent surgeon was summoned to perform an immediate operation. And upon entering the operating room, however, the surgeon exclaimed, "I can't operate on this boy, he's my son." And my question is, how is this possible? The father was killed instantly, and the surgeon says, "I cannot operate this boy, he is my son." And also, I myself, but most people are confused who don't know this example, and I get answers like, yeah, that is a same-sex couple, so that is the second father, and who sees his son, or somebody says, no, the surgeon recognizes his own son in this boy, but in fact it is the mother who is the surgeon and who says, "I cannot operate on this boy." So just to illustrate that we all still have, many of us have still this social representations that surgeons are men, but also women, of course. Many women are also surgeons. And so this is a little example that suddenly in the communications, existing prevailing social representations can influence the interpersonal communication. I would like now to introduce the TOPOI lens. That's another aim of the TOPOI model. So instead of zooming out, as I showed in the beginning, zooming out to the national background or the religion of a person to try to explain behavior or attitudes and the differences, the TOPOI model is used. You can use it to zoom in on the conversation. It's not zooming out, but zoom in on the conversation and the context to reflect possible differences and misunderstandings in the communication. I explained already what TOPOI stands for. So, and if you look at an communication, a conversation where things go wrong, you can reflect on each area. And you can, in the area of tone, the language, you can ask yourself, what are they saying, and what is the meaning of the body language people use. In the second area, a reflection question could be, what is everyone's view and thinking on the issue at hand? The area of persons, how does each see the other, and how do they experience the mutual relationship? And the organizational level, what is the situational, organizational, and societal factors that play maybe a role in this conversation that causes the misunderstandings or the differences. And the last area, as I said before, very important for me is what motivates each person. What are everyone's motives, emotions, needs, and values? So these are reflection questions you can ask yourself during a conversation, during conversations when the communication gets blocked, that you very short, very brief, ask yourself, has to do maybe with the language, maybe we have a different view, maybe there's something wrong on the interpersonal level, the relational level, maybe there are some situational factors that play a role, or maybe I don't know what motivates the other person. And you could also ask the other person, that you say, okay, I feel that our communication is not going well. Has it something to do with what I say, or that you have a different view, our relationship? So in that sense, you can also meta-communicate and start a meta-communication about the communication, what goes wrong in our communication. And also possible that there is an influence of social representations, certain prejudices, stereotypes, or social norms that influences someone's communication. I will give an example. I will apply it on a case study. This is sometimes I ask the participants to deliver a case study from their practice, because I always want to link very closely to their practice, so the questions they have. And this is what a professor, he's also a mentor, he brought in this case study. It was of the bachelor study Human Resource Management of a Dutch university. And this professor wrote the following. A Surinamese Chinese student in the third semester of the bachelor study Human Resource Management has a slightly physical disability. I didn't add this part, this sentence, but he really wrote this also in the case study. She is not assertive. In student groups, she doesn't say much, and she is withdrawn. She finds it hard to participate in discussions, to say her opinion, and to be critical towards college students. She tells me she's not happy about that herself. My colleague professors fear that she is not competent for the study Human Resource Management, and that she will fail for her internship that is coming up. I asked her, during a mentor conversation I had with her, I asked her whether her lack of assertivity is due to her culture, and the student confirms this and felt relieved. She said that it is impossible for her to be assertive at home, and I then ended the conversation, he wrote, the professor. This case study poses me for a major dilemma. On one side, the bachelor study program finds it crucial that all students have a critical and assertive attitude, and on the other side, to be assertive conflicts with the culture of this Surinamese Chinese student, and maybe also with that of all other international students. So that is what the professor wrote as a case study. And in the workshop, we discussed this, and we applied the TOPOI lens on this case study to try to find out from what goes wrong and what could he do different, the professor. And this is for me a very interesting case study, because you see here how powerful a culturalistic approach is. So he only focuses on her national background, being Surinamese Chinese. He writes that she has a slightly physical disability, but he doesn't take that in any way into account. Of course, it's also a pitfall to focus only on this ability. But no, it's interesting that he doesn't take that into account in the analysis. What makes it difficult for her to be assertive? Okay, maybe I give you 2-3 minutes to make your own reflection. So my question is, this professor comes to you and says, "This is my dilemma. This is my case study. What could you advise me?" So maybe take some minutes to think about possible differences, misunderstandings, and interventions he could make another time in another talk with the student. Okay, I will apply now I will now share with you how we use the TOPOI lens to reflect and analyze this case study. But once again, it is so interesting how powerful the culturalistic approach is, and it immediately focuses on her national background and thinks that is the problem, that it doesn't fit in her culture, and that's why she's not assertive. But when we discuss it afterwards, so in the workshop with TOPOI, I give you all the reflections we made according to the 5 TOPOI areas. And I start with tongue, but it is not necessary where you start. You can start everywhere. And as I said before, you cannot separate these areas. Sorry. But I separated them to find as many ideas, many hypotheses, what goes wrong, because that broadens and also the horizon and the possibilities to intervene. So first of all, concerning the language, the verbal and non-verbal language, one problem could be is that he has only suggestive questions, so has it to do with your cultures, and it would be better to explore, to inquire, and to ask open-ended questions from what makes it difficult for you to be assertive. And it could be also very interesting to find out what the meaning is of assertiveness. You both use these words, but maybe it has a different meaning for her. I mean, maybe she thinks that is that you are not polite. So explore, and it would also be good that the professor explain what for him, for the program, what it means to be assertive, and how you can see that when people are assertive, so to make it concrete. Now, this is also a very important reflection, since he sees the professor or the mentor sees this as a cultural issue, but in fact you could say it is a common issue of a study issue. There are many students who have problems with being assertive, to participate in discussion, to say their own opinion. It's not typical for students with an international background. And maybe that he sees this as a cultural issue is maybe the influence of social representations which are prevailing in the Dutch society, that you must respect other cultures, no discrimination, that these social representations influence him in the sense that he focuses so strong on the culture of this student, and wants to respect her cultural background. So important would be as an intervention that he sees and names the issue within the context of the university as a common study issue. So not don't make it extraordinary different. No, it's assertiveness. A student has problems with assertiveness. That is a very common study issue, and it would be good that he becomes aware of this social of the pressure of this social representation, of the social norm of be respectful to other cultures, don't discriminate, that he becomes aware of it, and also deal in a different way with these norms. Then in the next level, the next area of the persons, so he addresses her as a Surinamese Chinese, and she sees herself as a daughter. It's for me impossible to be assertive at home. But in this context, he's talking to her as a student. Think again of the multiple identities and how they can alternate, how they can switch. So he could say to her, I can understand that as a daughter at home, it is difficult for you to be assertive. But it also would be interesting to find out, to ask her if you disagree with your parents, is it possible to say something, and to find out what her way of being assertiveness is. But he could also, important for the professor to say, I address you now as a student. And so you have chosen for this study. You are already in the third semester. What makes it difficult for you to be assertive? In what situation do you participate in discussion? Do you say your own opinion? And so you more exploring what kind of conditions, in what context, what could make it possible for her to be assertive. Now, organization, it's very important to explore, as I said before, the context in which a student is not assertive, because it could be that it has to do with her fellow students, also the interaction with the professor, maybe the method. So it's very important also to explore what factors in the context in the organization it makes it difficult for her to be assertive. I think of an interview with a Chinese colleague and a team member, of whom the colleague said, he comes from a silent culture, a shy culture. So he's Chinese, and that's why he doesn't participate in discussions. But in an interview with him, the team member himself said, no, it's not because of my culture. It's because they talk so fast, my colleagues. I don't get the chance to say something, and sometimes they use jargon, slang, words which I don't understand. So that were the reasons were more the context of his colleagues and how they interacted with him, and not his shy culture, his Chinese culture. And the last one is, of course, assumption of the goodwill. The tutor absolutely has his positive intentions. He wants to be respectful, but the effect of his communication, and often there is a difference between intentions and the impact of one's communication. But the negative impact of his being respectful is that he focuses only on her cultures and gets stuck in a dilemma. And very important, we found out the sentence, she is not happy about that. In that sentence, there is a wish hidden, so I also want to change. So he could explore, what do you mean by that you are not happy with that? And because there is an opening, there is a clue to open up the discussion for how to change and how to acquire this competence of assertiveness. So you see, with this TOPOI lens, with this example, that it broadens much more the horizon of possible interventions you could make instead of only seeing it as a cultural problem. So I hope it clarifies a little bit how you could use the TOPOI lens and how it could support you. And you see also that the interventions you can make are general communications interventions. You need general communication skills to be diversity competent and to deal with misunderstandings and difference. Okay, so far my input, and I think it's now time to open for discussions and questions. I want to say two things. First of all, I want to show my last slide. Because again, today you learn about all kinds of methods, the TOPOI model and so, but I liked very much to finish with a saying of Yiddu Krishnamurti, who said, there is no method, only attention. And I really thank you by heart for your attention for this during this workshop.